Friends, for the exciting world of paradigms, theory, and social research. Chapter 2. So we're going to start by looking at paradigms and a little bit about theories as well. So a paradigm is a model or frame of reference through which to observe and understand, whereas theories seek to explain. So, for example, if you've taken Intro to Soc, you might remember that early on in the semester, there's 3 paradigms that get presented, right? And one is the structural functional paradigm. This is the idea that you're looking at institutions, so something like religion or family or education, and looking at it from the perspective of like, what function does it serve, okay? Another paradigm in sociology is conflict theory, right? And that's looking at how society and how structures in society might produce conflict. Okay. Theories are seeking to explain behavior. Paradigms provide a framework that the theories are created in. Okay. Logic refers to a system of principles for determining how valid an explanation is. And rationality is a logical system of explanation that's associated with science. So when we're talking about rational explanations, right, we mean something that's not supernatural, so not like ghosts did it. It's objective. It is allied with empirical observations, okay? When we test logical expectations, we have to include for the idea that we could fail. Now, because we want our theories to be rational doesn't mean human behavior has to be rational. In fact, human behavior is limited in its rationality. So theories are seeking to provide logical explanations for us, right? It should explain things for us so that we're not like, oh, it's just a fluke that this thing happened, right? It should help us make sense of patterns we're observing, and they shape and direct our research efforts. Let's think about some general social science paradigms, right? So paradigms are so implicit. You guys are actually familiar with a lot of these. You just probably have not been taught about them specifically as paradigms. Okay, so let's think about something like the culture here in the US, right? We are strongly individualistic, and we take this for granted. Other cultures see this as bizarre, right? So we're very like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps here, and we're very much like, we'll hold up one example of someone who grew up with every disadvantage who is now like a billionaire and be like, see, anyone can do it. Recognizing the paradigms that we're operating within, though, provides some benefits for us. So first of all, things that might seem bizarre to others, we can start to make sense of them once we sort of understand that paradigm. It's also good for us to step outside of like our main paradigm, to step outside our point of view and look at things from a different point of view. Paradigms are not true or false. They're just ways of looking at things. So theories can be macro or micro level, okay? Macro level is we're looking at like the big picture, whole societies. So things like international relations, class struggle. Whereas micro theories are trying to explain social life at like an individual level, someone's dating behavior, how a jury deliberates, etc. Now, a meso theory is sort of in between. This would be the study of like organizations, communities, and social categories. So Auguste Comte is a sociologist, a criminologist, and he comes up with this idea called positivism. Okay, and positivism is a philosophical system based in proving or disproving scientific assertions. You guys remember, I think in chapter 1, I told you guys about empirical evidence, right, or empirical research. That's what positivism is. So, crim friends, you might remember that the very earliest explanations of criminal behavior are often supernatural, right? So they might say, oh, you're possessed by demons, and then they would like drill holes in your skull to let the demons out, okay? Then we went on to this very all crime is a free will choice, right? People weigh the pros and cons, and then they choose, okay? That's classical school of thought. And then we move to positivism. Now, positivism is a bigger, broader field, but in criminal justice, we're talking about scientific explanations of crime. Positivism is a knowable, objective reality that is studied scientifically, where we try to prove or disprove something. Conflict theory is a paradigm, as I mentioned, right? This is a paradigm in sociology. It's also a paradigm in crim. It's probably a paradigm in human services too, although sorry, human service friends, I'm not as familiar with this. But this looks at human behavior as an attempt to dominate others and to avoid being dominated. Conflict theory is about power and control, okay? So like Karl Marx says social behavior is best explained as the process of conflict. Others have looked at small scale conflict, right? But conflict theory is things like, the 1%, or how people with power are able to maybe get away with things that other people without power can't get away with. Now, symbolic interactionism is I told you already, structural functionalism, then we got conflict theory. Symbolic interactionism is the third big paradigm in sociology. And this is looking at human behavior through our social interactions. And it basically sort of says that there isn't necessarily an objective reality out there, but that we create meaning in our interactions with others. Now, that might sound complex, but you guys have actually probably all done this at one point or another. Hold on, I feel a sneeze coming. Okay, it's not going to come. All right, so this is, a good way to think about this is maybe like text message, right? You get a text message from someone. When we're texting, we don't have tone, we don't have body language, and sometimes we assume people meant something other than what they actually did mean, right? Simmel is interested in how individuals interact with one another. Mead talks a lot about taking the role of the other, right? So like sort of putting yourself in someone else's shoes and trying to see something from their perspective. Other forms of study might include something like ethnomethodology. This is how people are creating social structure through their actions and interactions. And ethnomethodology is the methodology of the people. This is also like an ethnograph is a type of research. I already told you about structural functionalism. Okay, so those three main ones you learned in Soc are structural functionalism, symbolic interactions, and conflict theory. But then there's newer ones too, okay? So feminist paradigms. This is where we try to look at things through the view or the experiences of women. So friends, I'm sure you all know this because we are upper level social science majors at this point in our academic careers. But most theory has been written by, tested on, experimented with men. Okay, and overwhelmingly white men, okay? So here's a tried and true fact that my crim folks will know, but the rest of you might not know, okay? 75% of crime is committed by men. 25% of crimes committed by women. This is a pretty consistent statistic. It's been consistent for like decades and decades, okay? Most of our theories about crime are tested on, invented by men, okay? How come women commit crime at such a lower rate? Are we just superior? Is there something different about us? What would be the reason for that? Well, we need feminist theories in order to think about that. Okay? Feminist theories call attention to aspects of social life that other paradigms do not reveal. It's sort of like an offshoot of conflict theory, but focused more specifically on gender. You guys might recall if you've taken other classes with me that I have this little assignment I've been fond of where we look up information about the authors of our research articles. And we look up like what's their education, what's their race, what's their gender. And part of that is that we can look and see who's writing our ideas, who's doing our research, right? If what we're reading is not diverse, if it doesn't include the perspectives of people with different lived experiences, are we getting all the right information? Critical race theory is also an offshoot of conflict theory. Critical race theory was in the news maybe a year or two ago. People were very upset, arguing that critical race theory was being taught to children in school. Technically, critical race theory is a law school theory, and that's where it's taught. But very similar to that is conflict theory that's focusing on race, right? What role does race play in our society? How do we achieve racial justice, okay? And some, important theorists in this field are Du Bois, Derek Bell. Now, Comte comes back to this idea where he says society can be studied rationally and objectively, right? The more science we know, the less superstitious we are. Now, that's not to say we're not still superstitious. Some of you guys probably have, like, I don't know, lucky socks or a lucky object or whatever, right? Maybe you wish on the first star you see at night. Whatever your thing is, right? But we've moved from thinking, oh, people break the law because they're possessed by demons or they're a witch, to what are rational explanations for this. Okay, so what are some concepts, some definitions, some things we need to know as we move into thinking about research methods? Okay, science is based on observations, okay, and it's based on like empirical scientific observation, okay, not something you do after the fact where you're like, oh, yesterday I think I saw a lot of red cars, okay. Science would be sitting down at a certain location at a certain time and actually taking notes on what the colors of the cars were that you saw. So when we talk about observations, we mean seeing, hearing, touching something, okay? A fact is a phenomenon that's been observed. Laws are generalizations about groups of facts. And then theories are explanations for observations that relate to some aspect of life, okay? Now, as we develop these theories, we're also going to talk about concepts, which are abstract elements representing phenomenon within our field of study. So a concept might be something like happiness or intelligence or fairness or justice, okay? We have to think about how we want to measure that. Variables are sets of attributes, right? So variables could be age, and then we could list the age of everybody in our class. It could be gender, and we could list the gender of everybody in our class. Axioms are assertions that we base our theories on. Propositions are specific conclusions from those axioms. And then our hypothesis, we're all familiar with what a hypothesis is, right? It's a relationship we think exists that we can test, right? So we could say poverty leads to crime. We could say being abused as a child leads to unhealthy relationships, right? And we could test that. So let's think about this traditional model of science, right? We've got a theory that we're going to develop our hypothesis from, right? So maybe my general theory is like poverty leads to crime, and then I'm going to have some specific hypotheses about that. Okay? Then I have to operationalize those concepts. What do I mean by poverty, right? I have to think about how I can measure that, how I'm defining that, okay? That's an operational definition. Think about things like delinquency or trauma, right? Or drug use. How do we define those things, okay? And then observations are actual observations. We're going to measure those things. So I'm going to define delinquency or trauma a certain way, right? And then I'm going to actually conduct some observations of that, collect some data about that, okay? We're going to use that to either confirm or disconfirm a hypothesis, okay? So we're going to engage in some hypothesis testing. And when we do that, we're going to have two types of hypotheses. The one we're really interested in is our research hypothesis. Poverty causes crime, or being abused makes you an abuser, okay? Those are hard to test directly. So what we do is we test what's called a null hypothesis. And a null hypothesis says there's no relationship between those variables. So I would say there's no relationship between poverty and crime. Then I would have some observations, some data. I could test this using math and figure out if that's true. And if I can reject the idea that there's no relationship, then that means that there is a relationship. Now we can do this a couple ways, right? Traditional models of science use deduction, right? All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, okay? Inductive logic works the opposite way. Socrates is mortal. Now I'm looking at other men. Okay, these guys don't live forever either. Oh, it looks like maybe all men are mortal. So if we're going to construct a theory deductively, we're going to start with our topic, and we're going to think about which phenomenon it addresses. We're going to identify our concepts and variables. We're going to find out what do we already know about those things, right? So what do we already know about poverty and crime? What do we already know about like being abused and being an abuser, okay? And then from that information, I'm going to draw a logical conclusion, okay, to the thing I want to test. So let me give you an example. I did my dissertation on statutory rape. Many of you have probably heard this ad nauseum, but statutory rape is sexual assault, penetration that occurs between somebody who's over the age of consent and somebody who's under the age of consent. So every state has an age of consent. If you're under the age of consent, we don't have to prove that, like, that's all we need to prove in order to prove that it's not consensual, right? So generally speaking, when we talk about a sexual assault, we're looking for whether or not consent is present. If you're under a certain age, which varies by state, you legally can't consent. So Massachusetts, the age of consent is 16. If you have sex with someone who's under the age of 16, oral, anal, vaginal sex with someone who's under the age of 16, you are guilty of statutory rape. Doesn't matter if that person came on to you first, if they initiated it, if they come into court and are like, I absolutely wanted to have sex with that person, they cannot legally consent. Okay? So statutory rape should be a pretty easy crime to prove because I don't have to prove intent. I just have to prove that sex occurred and somebody was underage. And yet it only has like a 35% clearance rate. Okay, so that's the rate at which people are arrested for that crime. So I wanted to look at what things are playing a role in that. What plays a role? What factors predict whether or not somebody gets arrested? Okay? So after looking at what little research there is on this topic, I had sort of my own ideas. Okay? So I tested a few things. First, I looked at characteristics of victims and offenders in the offense. Like, are they men? Are they women? How old are they? What's the age difference between the victim and the offender? Then in my second paper, I looked at things like how much power someone might have or how much power a community might have. So I looked at things like social disorganization and poverty and whether or not those things played a role in arrest rates. Now, inductive theories, we'd be looking at some aspects of social life, looking for some universal principles. Probably one of the most well-known methods for this is what's called grounded theory, right? So we look at aspects of social life and then we look for patterns, okay? Or field research, we go out and we observe something happening or we observe people and we draw some conclusions from that. Now, just to wrap up, right, research can be deductive or inductive, right? So deductive models, we're using research to test theories. Inductive models, we have data, we analyze it, we develop a theory from that.